We gather this morning to celebrate the life of Martha Sunder, a life that made a lasting impact on her son Hans and wife Eva, Martha's extended family, friends, and many more who weren't able to attend today. Today we reflect on the life of Martha and God's goodness and grace in her life, and the goodness and grace that she extended to so many of us. And although we can look fondly at a life well lived, there is pain that we feel because there is someone so dear to us that is missing here today. Today is our chance to say goodbye to a friend, a sister, an aunt, and a mother. Let's pray. Father, you are the author and giver of life, and we thank you for not only creating us, but journeying with us. Amen. Today we reflect on Martha and how her life reflected a journey with you, and we celebrate that today. Amen. Father, you know our inmost thoughts, and you know there are mixed feelings here today. You are the author of grace, and only you are able to relieve our pains and hurts, to give us joy. So, Father, today, make your presence known and your peace evident in our hearts. Thank you for being here, for loving us, and walking this road with us. Amen.
Amen.
As I met with Hans, Eva, and Karen last week, a theme that continually arose was that of friendship. Martha was a great friend in many ways, and I believe she modeled her life after the friendship that Jesus extended her, that Jesus extends to us. And a song that reflects this is What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So please rise to your feet and sing with us.
At times, when my mother visited us in Madison, we were a little desperate to find something for her to do. One time when she was 84, I sat her down in front of my computer and introduced her to news groups, to a drawing program, and to a word processor. She just loved it. So the next time we visited Edmonton, I brought along a cast-off but functional computer and installed it on the duplex on 105th Street. She quickly learned how to do a number of tasks on it. In particular, she wrote several autobiographical articles about important events in her life. Since she had always been a far better storyteller than I am, I will quote once in a while from The Story of My Life, written by her when she was 93 years old. I would like to lead with one quote from her story, which is a theme of this celebration. My life was surrounded with people. I am a feeler, trying to help if possible. Marthadam was born on April 26, 1917, more than a century ago, near the city of Toren in the eastern part of Germany, Westpreußen. Her parents, Ida and Wilhelm Adam, were part of a many centuries-long trend of Germans settling, absorbing, and displacing the Slavic peoples eastward. This came to an end in 1918 after the Great War, when her home became part of a newly created Poland. There she grew up on a small farm, the fifth oldest of eventually 10 siblings, 5 boys and 5 girls. Here she is, on the lap of her mother, with the 4 older siblings, Siegfried, Elisabeth, Adolf, and Gottlieb. We owe the existence of these pictures to Uncle Kurt and to Harold Walling, who scanned many old photos for his epic family biography published in 2000. I was told that the local school, which was taught in Polish, the kids learned German at home, had only 5 grades. To keep them in school until the proper age, they simply took each grade twice. Here, a school picture of the class in 1931, when Martha was 14 years old, next to her, Elisabeth, 16, in the second row, Herta, 12, and the bottom row, Otto, 9. In looking at this picture, I quote my mother and her autobiography. Thinking back, I must have been a happy girl. Sometimes I giggled and laughed uncontrollably until tears came. Once I heard someone say, "You recognize a fool by his laughter." So I tried to control my laughing, ended up being too serious sometimes. See the picture. One day my mother said to me, "My daughter, what is the matter with you? You look so angry." I did not realize that I looked this way until I looked in the mirror. I had copied the serious expression of my pastor, Mr. Sonnenberg, who usually had, because I admired him very much. About this time, the Adams family got together for a picture of the entire family, the only one that I have. The father, Wilhelm, died in 1937. In all, 2 of the siblings, Adolf and Gottlieb, 1 spouse, Gottlieb's wife, and Adolf's 2 daughters died during and immediately after the war. The rest made it safely to Germany and later to Canada. Only the youngest girl, Traute, is alive today. The family was devout. In my mother's words, growing up in a Christian home, we were sheltered and safe. We believed that all good things are from God and the evil comes from Satan. We tried to be good. We also knew that we had to invite Jesus into our heart to become a Christian. When I was 16, I decided to follow Jesus. I still feel the joy that came into my heart that day. I knew that God had forgiven me everything I had ever done wrong and was now living in my heart through the Holy Spirit. One by one, every 2 years, one of the Adams kids finished school and set about starting their independent lives. Although it was now wartime, my mother met a young man, Oswald Reich, a butcher by trade, and they got married in 1940 in a double ceremony with her younger sister, Herta Krause. It is a sobering reminder of how much medicine has improved over the years to note that both Martha's husband and her father lost their first wives in childbirth. Here the happy couple at the wedding and a year or 2 later. In things large and small, my mother was always sensitive to the feelings and needs of others. You can see in these pictures how considerate she is about not seeming taller than my father. Bit of a sore point at times in the family. A year later, they were living in the Baltic coast town of Sopot near Danzig, now Gdansk, where they ran a butcher shop. The war began in earnest. My father was at first a cook for the local army garrison, so he was able to live at home, with the result that in 1943, I came into the world. This is a couple of years later after that. Eventually, my father moved to the French front, where he was wounded in 1944. He told me he was thankful for that. For him, the war was essentially over. Meanwhile, back in Poland, my mother was on her own and decided to join the rest of the family in fleeing the advancing Russian army. In the middle of January 1945, she, with her 19-month-old son, Tante Traute, and my grandmother, embarked on the 6-week, 700-kilometer trek with horse and wagon, barely staying ahead of the Russian front. The success of this journey for us, and also for many thousands of other refugees from the East, was in part due to the exceptionally cold winter of 1945. It was minus 20 degrees centigrade when they left, according to Tante Emmy. Although this certainly caused much hardship and even deaths, here's how my mother described it. The first day, we had to cross the Weichsel River, the Vistula. The bridge was occupied by the military. Thank God for the unusual winter and the help of the military who helped us over the ice. This was the first time in years that the river had frozen solid. We were thankful to God when we got to the other side of that. Notice their journey started just on the other side of the Weichsel. During this time, we saw my father only rarely. My mother quickly settled in. She wrote, Amazingly, almost the entire family eventually found their way to the small village of Stedebergen in northern West Germany, where we were assigned rooms in local residence homes and businesses, not without arousing some resentment, we should say. By the time my father recovered from his injuries, hostilities were finished, and he spent the next 3 years in France as a prisoner of war in forced labor at a winery. He was fortunate. The overseer told the Germans assigned to her, "I am going to treat you the way I would wish my son would be treated if Germany had won the war." During this time, we saw my father only rarely. My mother quickly settled in. She wrote, "Our landlords, the Drells, had 2 daughters, Alma, 12, and Erica, 10. We became close friends quickly, especially with Erica. We felt welcome. They had a restaurant, a grocery store, and a post office. It did not take long before I got a job with the Drell family. Every morning I delivered the mail for the village. The rest of the day I worked in the store, and if necessary, also in the restaurant. I loved my work very much." End quote. Erica and her daughter Elizabeth would later join us in Edmonton. I started school in Stedebergen, together with cousin Doris, eldest daughter of Siegfried. We're the only 2 cousins that have the same age. Here a picture of the family living in Stedebergen in 1950. During a visit from Tante Amanda, Ida Adams' sister, I believe the Siegfried Adam family and the Bollings were already in Canada at this time. I would be seeing a lot of these kids over the next 70 years, left to right. Dieter Wieser, me, Karen Schultz, Peter Schultz, Ulrich Wieser, and Kurt Zeip, the 5 kids at the bottom. My father returned for good in 1948 and found the economic situation still desperate, paid work often unavailable. I remember he would follow the official apple pickers who worked the fruit trees that lined the local highways to find a few missed or dropped apples to take home to us. Similarly, we would go out into the potato fields after the potato harvest and dig around to find a few missed potatoes. During those years, my mother said she was very happy that I hated to drink milk because there wasn't any to be had anyway. So began talk of migrating to Canada, and specifically the Edmonton area, where there was a connection through the Church of God with earlier German immigrants, mostly farmers, who were willing to sponsor us. First went the Bollings in 1949, then the Siegfried Adam family and us in 1950, followed by my grandmother, the Wiesers, Schultzes, and the boys, Kurt and Otto, in 1951. Herta Krause came a little later. Getting started in a new country with no knowledge of English, a couple of suitcases of belongings, and a substantial debt for the voyage was entirely a bootstrap operation, powered by hard work and cooperation. Together with the Schultzes, a 1-car garage was built on a lot next to where Siegfried Adam was building a house, and we and the Wieser family, 4 adults and 4 children, moved into it and spent the winter. There was no electricity. They didn't want to attract attention from the city health authorities for this arrangement. No running water and no bathroom. Sometimes the chamber pot froze during the night. For me and the Wieser kids, it was a wonderful adventure, but one can only imagine what the parents went through. In the spring, the Wiesers moved out, and the Schultzes moved into the garage with us. The 2 families started building their first house on the same lot, using plans already available from Siegfried's house next door, and moved into it when it became livable. These living arrangements showed the close relationships between the Adams family, which continued throughout the years. After a couple of years, my father set about moving us to the south side to be closer to Gaynors, where he had found work, and build a second house on 78th Avenue and 96th Street. Soon, my grandmother moved in with us. Here she is with family and friends. And not just her. Sometime in the mid-50s, I was home alone when a census taker knocked on the door. I let him in and gave him the details of our little family. He closed his book and got up to leave, and I said, "Well, my grandmother also lives with us." And he sat down again, recorded that, got ready to go. And I said, "Well, there's also my Uncle Carl, who lives in the room next door." Again, he made his notes and again got up to leave. And I said, "Hold on. Downstairs, 3 of my older cousins, Alice, Annie, and Willy, and their mother live in one of the rooms. And we were not done yet. In the other room lived Horst and Ellie Shepia." This illustrates not only how these German immigrant families cooperated in their push out of poverty, but also the hospitality and love of people that my mother always showed. In addition to the ones I mentioned, I remember Erika and Liz Hultstrung, Edeltraud and Alice Thom, Fritz Schröder, Klaus Dojan family, Uschi Teichgräber, Siegfried Schultz, Emmy Schiemann, and Gudrun Breitkreuz also lived at various times in the same house as my mother and father. I always suspected that the many people who shared a house with us through the years were for my father a way to balance their and our budget, and for my mother a source of emotional and spiritual balance in her life. I know she formed lasting, deep relationships with many of these guests. A few from this period are shown here, and there are probably a number of others in the audience. Horst and Ellie Schepian and Erika and Elisabeth Hillstrom. And here is Uschi Teichgräber on her wedding day in 1974, thanking Great Aunt Martha for the support she provided during her somewhat tumultuous courtship. She and her mother were at that time living with my mother at the duplex. Back to our timeline. In 1957, on New Year's Day, my grandmother died in our house. Oma had become very much integrated into our daily lives. She was very close to my mother, so it was a wrenching event for her, and she had great difficulty getting past it. But life went on, and my mother slowly recovered her joy of life and her enthusiasm for her church, for work, and for family life. She was the only member of our little family with real musical talent. I learned to play the organ and clarinet, but that mostly meant that I was good with my fingers. Amazingly, she had an almost photographic recall for the melodies and texts of German hymns. A year ago, she could still sing all 4 or 5 verses of dozens and dozens of songs from memory. Even during recent months, when her dementia had mostly destroyed her ability to speak, she could still recite parts of her favorite ones. I believe that Peter and Karen's ability to sing these hymns with her and for her were a great comfort to her in her last difficult years.
Jesus kennt unseres Herzens Tiefen, leitet uns treulich aus und aus. Es kann kein Freund so wie Jesus lieben, keiner nein, keiner nein.
That was a couple of months ago. In 1962, the family started work on a third house, the duplex on 105th Street, here shown during a visit by a sister of my, by a sister of my grandmother. Shortly after the duplex was built, I left home for more education in the U.S. It was a lonely time for me at first, but every once in a while I would get care packages from my mother, since she knew I loved her delicious Hefekuchen, which she would bake on an epic scale, 15 or more slabs at a time, and pass them out to anybody who seemed to be in need of some sweets. I came back to Edmonton as often as money and time allowed, here in 1965 for my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, and in Christmas 1966. I had an exceptionally close relationship with my mother. I was the only child, the only one in the entire family, and I had spent almost all of my formative first 5 years entirely with her alone. She was a profoundly admirable role model for me, and I always wished that I had her empathy for people, her social skills, her work ethic, her ability for taking decisive action when she saw injustice, and her devotion to God. My parents visited me twice in Los Angeles when I was going to school there, once shortly after I arrived, taking their first airplane trip. This was worthy of a picture. And then for my graduation in 1969, where my mother got to know Eva Lasdens. Not long after this, I married this young lady. We celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary just this year. I was delighted that so many members of my family made the long trip to the wedding in Seattle. I think 6 of my cousins were there and a number of aunts and uncles. When someone once asked my father how he came to find such a wonderful wife, he said, "Ich war auf Zack," which loosely but poorly translates to, "I was on the ball." I can say the same thing about my marriage. Eva and I settled in Madison, where my parents visited us in 1977 to see our new house. This turned out to be the last time I saw my father. A few months later, he passed. My mother was a widow at age 60. Again, a difficult time in her life, living alone and living single in a society of couples. She traveled, visited her nephews, Arnold in Poland and Walter in East Germany in 1978, and joined us on a trip to the Grand Cayman Islands in the Caribbean in 1980. I did try to teach her snorkeling at that time with no success whatsoever. Then, in 1981, out of the clear blue sky, my mother dropped a bombshell on me. She was getting married again to her lifelong friend, Rudy Tsanda, who was also recently widowed. Not sometime in the future when we could plan to attend, but that same week. I wished them all the best with the thought, if they wanted us to be there, they would have made it possible for us to come. So I wasn't at the wedding. But here's the happy couple. The newlyweds turned out to be well-matched, and there followed 8 years of a loving, comfortable, and active life. They both liked to travel. Here an excerpt from her life story. In summer, we traveled by car, usually for 5 to 7 weeks, with my Plymouth Chrysler, visiting friends and relatives, some of them we had not seen for 50 years. We started from Edmonton, visited a cousin in Humboldt, Alberta, then friends in Regina, a cousin in Saskatoon, then on Winnipeg to visit Ruth Volling's family. Everywhere we felt very welcomed. From there to Hans-Jürgen's place. In Madison, we like to take short trips, like House on the Rock, some lakes, hiking, enjoying their cozy, relaxing yard with fruit trees and shrubs like Nanking cherries, mulberries, Saskatoons, raspberries, plums, and apples. We enjoyed Hans's barbecue and Evie's hospitality. Both of them honored Rudy with respect and love as a stepfather. It filled my heart with joy and gratitude. What lovely memories. From Madison, we continued our journey to Janesville, another Rudy's cousin. From there to Chicago, yet another cousin, and Columbus, Ohio, which Rudy had never had a chance to visit. They welcomed us all heartily. From there, several times we drove to the camp meeting at Anderson, Indiana for a week. 6,000 to 7,000 people attended these camp meetings. In one of their visits, the two painted the whole exterior of the house. I didn't appreciate quite what that meant until I did the same thing just a few months ago to our house. In others, they did extensive work to tame my somewhat wild backyard. In 1988, Evie's parents also, what did I do? I missed. Okay. In 1988, Evie's parents also came to Mass. Here's Evie's father and mother on the right side. The two families also went abroad together. Here a picture of the six of us in Hawaii in 1985 and in Germany in 1987 during a sabbatical I had at the university in Strasbourg. During the years with Rudy, an important mission enterprise was developed in my mother's house. Here her description. In church, we as a group started a craft day for mission. Emmy invented a cute mushroom pincushion. You can see the assembly line here. They became so popular and were very inexpensive to produce. I used to work in the knitting mill, famous Christie's or Cloverdale knitting mills, so I could supply the scrap wool for crocheting. Broomsticks were collected, I believe, by Emil Wieser, and cut up for the stems. New ideas were created from plastic or copied. All kinds of Kleenex houses, kittens, or famous donuts were sold every fall and in spring. I've put a few of these out on the table. The group of a dozen or so met weekly to work on this project and enjoy each other's company, and I think the company was as important as the work they did with each other. Rudy and Martha seemed to spend a large part of their waking time all week creating these little objects of art. Their heart was really in it. Even during their visits to Madison, there were few moments of idleness. Kittens, houses, birds, mushrooms, and others were continuously being created. The group sold these items in the mall several times a year. In addition to these crafts, the group also began a home bakery operation for charity, making their signature delicious donuts, Schulzenohr, 150 dozen at a time, once or twice a month, selling them for $5 a dozen. The group selected a worthwhile charity, Kinderhilfswerk, Global Care, and over a period of years, they donated over $160,000 earned from these crafts and baked goods. During one of our visits to Edmonton in 1989, Rudy and his friend Fred Zeuter went fishing. They were late getting back, and finally, well after midnight, Fred's policeman's son, Joy Zeuter, came to the door and brought tragic news. There had been a boating accident, and both friends had drowned. At the age of 72, my mother was again a widow. It was the beginning of another lonely time, and it hit her very hard. We tried to help and included her in our travel plans whenever possible. In 1966, we took our two recently widowed mothers to Banff and stopped at Ulrich and Lily's lovely place on the way. Then a trip to Jasper, staying at Pyramid Lodge Lake. My mother also continued visits to Madison almost every year, here in 1993 with both our mothers for my 50th birthday. Sometimes she brought company, here with Erica Holstrong in 1990. Erica has never let me forget, especially when I brag about how much warmer Madison is than Edmonton, that a couple of days after my birthday on May 6th, we woke to find an inch or two of snow on the ground, bending down the blooming daffodils. And with my brother Kurt, with her brother Kurt, 1996, enjoying the hundreds of blooming crabapple trees in the University of Wisconsin Arboretum on a hot summer day, I climbed to the top of a cliff at a local lake. She also traveled to Brazil and to Jerusalem and joined us twice on trips to Europe. First, a visit to Bad Godesberg in 1985, where we enjoyed a Rhine cruise with her cousin Emmy Schmidt. On the way back to our home base in Marburg, we found this wonderful field of lupine. I think only in Germany will one see such a lovely sight on a roadside. The two years later, we met in Warsaw, Poland. From there, we traveled to Sopot, a beach town near Danzig, where I was born and our family lived during the war. My mother's knowledge of Polish was very handy during this trip, here on the beach in Sopot. We found the building where my father ran his butcher shop. The bottom of the butcher shop upstairs is where we lived. It had become an electronics gadget shop, was at that time. Apparently a restaurant before that where they hadn't taken down the signs yet. After Sopot, we traveled south to Krakow. There's Eva and my mother in the middle, in the central square in Krakow, where I was attending a conference. There we had a chance to visit our mother's nephew Arnold and his family in nearby Katowice. Arnold had been orphaned and marooned in Poland after the war. He was the only one of the three children of Martha's oldest brother, Adolf, to survive the war's aftermath. I don't want to give the impression that my mother's life was all travel. She did piecework, making jeans at the GWDG, the Great Western Garment Company, as did a number of other people at that time, for 7 years, ran Cloverdale Knitting Mill's sweater factory for 15 years, and together with Sister Emmy, ran a flower shop in West Edmonton Mall for several years, not to mention thousands of hours of crafts and baking and many other activities that she engaged in. A comment on the Adams family. Here are the 7 surviving Adams siblings in 2004, featured in an Edmonton Journal article about the family. This was viewed as a remarkable situation. The love of family that held these folks together is quite remarkable. After the war, all except one found their way to a little village in Germany. All emigrated to Edmonton. All lived in Edmonton the rest of their lives. And all but one spent the last year or more of their lives in the Lakeside Complex on 28th Avenue, 4 of them in the same building even. My mother always had a heart for young people, and they for her. She taught Sunday school at the Church of God for many years. One of her students, grandniece Uschi Teichgräber, who will be saying a few words later, organized a union at my mother's duplex in 1991. Here are many of these kids after they've grown up, but they came together to reminisce about their times with my mother. She was especially devoted to her nephews, nieces, grandnephews, and grandnieces, in particular those who might be encountering personal difficulties. I have often heard these young folks talk about her as a surrogate mother or grandmother, and I think she was a source of comfort and support for some of them. It was clear that she loved this role, perhaps in part because her son and daughter-in-law neglected to provide her with any grandchildren. She would regularly collect the young ones for get-togethers at her place, this one in the duplex at 2002, and at McDonald's. You can see her description below the picture in the picture book she made for me. Kids, my joy. Their joy too, I think, if you look at their faces. Here's a comment Karen received from a mother on her Facebook page just a few days ago. Yes, our children still talk of those times. She took them to McDonald's and the parties she had for the kids. She made a huge impact. She was a special auntie to many of us. I had many great conversations with her, and she was a prayer warrior. I see her rejoicing in heaven with the Lord. In 2001, she had a serious auto accident where an SUV running a red light broadsided her. Even though the accident was not her fault and she recovered fuller from her serious injuries, this was the first time she had to come to terms with the limitations old age was going to increasingly place on her sphere of operations. During the following years, I know that the slow loss of capabilities and independence, the enforced idleness for someone who had worked nonstop for many decades, and especially losing the ability to help others, often brought her to the edge of despair. The little Honda was gone, and she decided that she would no longer be driving a car. Couple of years later, she moved out of her duplex into the condo on 28th Avenue, recommended by Otto Volling, who had purchased a unit there. 2 hip fractures at age 89 and 95, each of which might have rendered a normal person bedridden, as well as cancer surgery and a heart attack, all had their after effects, both physically and mentally, but she got back on her feet after each one. In 2001, at the age of 99, she finally could no longer live alone, even with the assistance provided by Monica Sinha and by the staff of Bayshore Home Care. So she moved into the Wedman House, and finally, during her last 6 months, at the Shepherd's Care, sharing for a brief while a room with younger sister Emmy, who died in that room the day before my mother's 102nd birthday. During her last years, I am grateful for the assistance, comfort, sympathy, love, and companionship she got from caretaker Monica, nephews Peter Schultz and Harvey Schultz, and nieces Uschi Teichgraber, Carmen Metz, and very especially Karen Deppner. Angels in heaven are a matter of faith. Angels on earth are people like Karen. And I think also my mother when she was at her best. As you can see from this narrative, my mother lived a full and productive life. She went through difficult periods, but her deep faith and trust in God carried her through, and she always treasured her many interactions with friends and relatives, all of whom were truly special to her. We all loved her and will miss her, but have already had to say painful goodbyes to many aspects of her skill set and personality over the last few years. During this time, the afterlife was often on her mind. Now she is with God and awaits her loved ones to join her. I want to thank all of you for coming to this celebration.
Each step I take, my Savior goes before me, and with his loving hand he leads the way. And with each breath I whisper, I adore thee. Oh, what joy to walk with him each day. Each step I take, I know that he will guide me to higher ground. He ever leads me on, until someday the last step will be taken. Each step I take just leads me closer as I feel my faith begin to waver, when up ahead I see a chasm wide, it's then I turn and look up to my Savior. I am strong when He is by my side. Each step I take, I know that He will guide me to higher ground. He ever leads me on, until someday the last step will be taken. Each step I take just leads me closer home. I trust in God, no matter come what may, for life eternal is in His hand. He holds the key that opens up the way, that will lead me to the promised land. Each step I take, I know that He will guide me to higher ground. He ever leads me on, until someday the last step will be taken. Each step I take just leads me closer home.
Martha spent her life investing in the lives of others, and I am ever so grateful she invested in mine. When my Oma passed away, Mom and I went to live with Aunt Martha and Uncle Oswald. They went from being an empty nesters to having a teenager in the house. I have so many fond memories of those years, our trips to Banff and swimming in the hot springs, eating supper outside in the Laube on warm summer evenings, going to the park across the street late at night with Aunt Martha, Gudrun, Emmy, and my mum, and swinging on the swings to see who could swing the highest, or even being goofy while doing supper dishes. I remember Aunt Martha reading several chapters of a book called The Pilgrim's Progress. It was a wonderful book. Uncle Oswald had suffered a mini stroke, which affected his sight for a short time. Aunt Martha made the best out of a difficult and uncertain situation, and we all looked forward to hearing about the pilgrim's journey each night. She had such a positive outlook on life. Aunt Martha took great care to nurture relationships. She had an open door and an open heart. If you needed to talk, she was there to listen. If you needed sound, godly advice, you received it. And if you needed an advocate or encouragement, you found it with Aunt Martha. You see, before there was a Dr. Phil, we had an Aunt Martha. She shared her spiritual victories and her struggles and God's faithfulness in all of life's circumstances. Aunt Martha also loved celebrations. I've lost count on how many wedding showers and baby showers, birthday parties, and the annual Christmas party with the children that she hosted. The more the merrier. If you ran out of table room, you simply added another table. There was always room for one more. My children used to tease Aunt Martha, calling her the Energizer Bunny, because she kept going and going and going. Aunt Martha's love for family and friends was evident in everything she did. She cherished us, she loved us, and most importantly, she prayed for us. She often kept a list of prayer requests and names of people she was praying for. I remember thinking, no wonder she has to take power naps after supper. I'm sure it took her half the night to get through these lists. I have missed our talks. She was always there, She was my voice of reason and encouragement. I will miss hearing my Naoshi, but I know I will see her again someday. Aunt Martha often told me to find joy in the ordinary small things of life. It was easy to celebrate the big adventures, a little bit more difficult to cherish the small things, and she was right. I will cherish those ordinary, everyday moments the very most.
When I think of my Tante Marta, I think of love. She was exceptional at so many things in her long life, but for me, the way she loved was her superpower. She shared love in every area of her life, and I'd like to share how I experienced this. One of these ways was by serving others. Tante Marta shared her love by being active in her church and through her missions work. Not long ago, I heard these words, "We are alive to the extent that we serve." I grew up seeing Tante Marta serve. Just one example, spending many years often took place in her home, a hub of activity where hearts and busy hands gathered to create. I recall as a child seeing her tables covered in those lovely Kleenex boxes and other handcrafts and baking, all to be sold. The funds generated by this labor of love went directly to help others. Together with family, many beloved friends, and her church community, Tante Marta devoted so much of her life to serving others. Tante Marta had a deep love for God. From the time that I was old enough to understand, right through to the last weeks of her life, I could see how her faith in God was strong and precious and ever-present. I believe it guided her, comforted her, held her up, and gave her great joy and tremendous peace through all the ups and downs of her life until the time that he took her home. Now for family, we are a big one. I always proudly tell people that my dad was the baby in a family of 10 children. I enjoyed seeing Tante Marta with her siblings, and I believe she had a unique and special relationship with each one of her brothers and sisters. I often chuckled at their banter and interactions with one another as they acted like brothers and sisters do. But I also stood in awe over how deeply and lovingly connected they were. Being at her home when they came together for meals and celebrations gave me such a rich sense of family and connection. These gatherings often included her beloved friends, which she embraced as family. Everyone had a place at that long table, and everyone was loved. I think of this when I pull my table out to expand it to make a place for each member of my growing family. Her love for her siblings and her in-laws flowed down to their children. As cousins, we had something so wonderful in our Tante Marta. Didn't she make each one of us feel so special? How blessed we were to have her love us and touch our lives for as long as we did. And that brings me to the little ones. I think Tante Marta had a special place in her heart for each one of the children in her life, a soft spot. She had an ability of making children feel treasured, and she did this in a million different ways. I'd like to share one beautiful example of this. From the time that my children were little, she held special luncheons for the young cousins. We would arrive to her table beautifully set with a tablecloth and china, little glasses, special serving forks and spoons, and place cards that she made for each child. Remember, this was a table set for little kids, but there was no plastic in sight, for she honored them by bringing out her best things. She served delicious food, which usually included her chicken noodle soup ladled into warmed bowls, followed by her scrumptious baking. Our kids and the generation before played in her yard, in the basement, with the long, colorful strands of braided yarn hanging from the closet, for sure one of my favorite things in her home, and even under the tables, and it was all okay with her. In later years, they would enjoy meals and treats in her condo and visits to the pond. Tante Marta adored the children in her life. She made them feel like their time together, regardless of how it was spent, was so very important to her. Lastly, I'd like to touch on the most precious love that she had, That was for her son Hans and for Eva. Her love for you just bubbled out of her, and oh, how proud she was of you. It was obvious to everyone that you were the light of her life, and I know how she felt so completely cherished by both of you. Tante Marta's life was rich with love, and it was woven so beautifully throughout the tapestry of her long, long life. We can continue to honor her by paying forward all of the beautiful love that she so generously shared with us, through living a life where our love flows freely and abundantly, just as hers always did. I love you, my auntie.
Most of you know me as Peter Schultz, one of the nephews. Martha Sander was a woman whose life revolved around God. She loved to pray and sing about Him. She was like a mother to me, especially when I was around 10 years old, when I lived with her family while my family was in Germany. They had reasoned with me that I would get more out of a visit with our relatives in Germany at an older age. I never hesitated about that, because I loved Aunt Martha and Hans, my cousin, a lot, and felt that I would have more freedom in their home than I was used to. Hans took me to Mill Creek to gather mosquito larvae for his angelfish, went rafting and swimming with me, and was like a brother to me despite our age difference. I'm glad we never had a TV. While some watched others having fun, we had fun ourselves. I wasn't a Christian at the time, but Aunt Martha was a very Christian mom to me, in that we always thanked God for our food, read the Bible often, and never missed church services. Aunt Martha was also my Sunday school teacher and acted and talked very Christ-like. She often sang gospel songs with me, especially when I visited her in the Shepherd's Care facility. Hans practiced the saying, "He who gives while he lives knows where it goes." He rewarded me with $50 for every visit I had with her. Hans knew that Aunt Martha and me had a mother-son type of relationship, and that this extra money for me would be wisely spent. I felt a great gratitude for the many privileges I had in life compared with most people. God gave me a deep love for people less fortunate than me, which I saw demonstrated to me by her and by my parents. I know Aunt Martha's greatest desire today is that each of us join her someday in heaven. That will be a happy reunion. God bless you all.
As has been presented today and witnessed by everyone here, we have come to remember a very special woman. The life shared through the eulogy and the images seen and the tributes paint us a picture that we can remember Martha by. I have my own special memories of my great-aunt, Tante Marta. I was one of the McDonald's club kids. For many years when I was a child, Tante Marta would invite children from the family and the church to her home. And I'm not sure how many of us would be there at a time, but it was a house full. After going to McDonald's and being allowed to buy whatever we wanted, we went back to her home to play games, run all around her house, and eat her candy dish and her supply of Schultzen Orange Dry. I remember going to the basement and jumping on the guest beds and making a big mess. Through all of that, I never remember her ever getting mad at us. She just loved on us. And whenever I saw Tante Marta, even in the last years when her memory was fading, she'd always light up with a smile, grab my hand, and say, "Mine Danny." One of the very few people that have ever called me Danny. I was blessed to know her and call her my tante. As I mentioned and was referenced in the eulogy and the tributes, Martha was first and foremost a friend. She cared deeply for people. She prayed often for people. And when there was a need that she saw, she looked to fill it in any way that she could. The love that Martha had for people went further than just words spoken, but were often followed by actions. This love that she shared came from a deep well filled by her relationship with her Savior, Jesus Christ. This was no secret. Martha was very open with her relationship with Jesus and prayed often for others to experience the love of God that she experienced. A passage of Scripture that highlights the relationship that we can have with God and can give us encouragement is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. Powerful words of Jesus. And Jesus says this, "I've loved you the way my Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done, kept my Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. You are my friends when you do the things that I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants because servants don't understand what their master is thinking and planning. No, I've named you friends because I've let you in on everything I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me. Remember, I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit, fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another." I believe that Martha tried to follow the life that was modeled by Jesus and love people the way that she herself felt loved, where she felt at home. To follow Jesus means to follow his commands. And we can get stuck in the do's and don'ts, the checking off of a list, what we are and aren't supposed to do. But this is all boiled down to the command, love one another. We love God. We follow the example of Jesus by fully loving those around us. Martha was not perfect, and we are not trying to paint her in that light. And as we have heard, she did not have an easy life. Yes, there were probably times where she was mad. She cried out to God, wondering why horrible events happened in her life. In a true friendship, there is safety to be who you are, to wrestle, and to second guess. We may tell ourselves that we can get through trials alone, that we need to be strong for others, and we need to be strong for ourselves. But here God is saying that we are able to go to him. God desires for us to fall into his arms, arms that give us protection, arms that embrace us and tell us that everything will be okay, arms that will never let go and never let us down. Through all of the highs and lows, Martha tried to stay true to the Father's love for her. Martha made herself at home in God's love. Martha felt at home within God's love, and she also knew the depth of that love. The passage says to put your life on the line for your friends. Another translation says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." This is modeled by God himself. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." God loves you so much, and it is through this love, through the example he gives us in Jesus Christ, that we are able to love others in that same way. Hans, you shared story after story when we met last week of Martha's love for others, laying down her life, her finances, her time, her security for them, for some of you. Martha knew that whatever she had was a blessing from God, and she wanted that blessing to be felt by others. Martha could feel at home in God's love and give her life for those around her because God chose her. Martha didn't earn God's love. She didn't purchase it, and she didn't deserve it. None of us do. However, God freely gave his love to her. Jesus said, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." God chose to have a relationship with Martha, and he extends that same offer to you and me. God is here in our midst. He walks beside us every day, and God has reached down his hand to us, to each of you. He has chosen you. Maybe for you today is the day to remember Martha's life, the good that she did in this world, and you want to carry on her legacy. Maybe God has been speaking to you and wants you to follow him, to accept this invitation in understanding what a relationship with him can mean for you. You have a choice to make, a choice we make every day to either accept or reject the love of God. One of Martha's favorite songs says, Jesus, mein Freund und Erlöser, Jesus, mein Leben und Licht, los durch die Gnad ich besinge, fröhlich das Blut, da frei mich spricht. Jesus, my friend and my Savior, Jesus, my life and my light, through God's grace I sing joyfully, because his blood has made me free. Martha knew God's love, understood its depth, because she accepted God's invitation of relationship. Through this, she was granted freedom and peace. May you sense the freedom and the joy that being a friend of Jesus can bring. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your unending love and grace. Thank you for your sacrifice for us. You know all things. You know what we wrestle with. You know our hurts and pains. And Father, as we say goodbye to Martha, I pray that you surround us with your hope, your peace, and your joy. Help us not to forget the memories that Martha left with us, the legacy that she leaves behind. I pray that we can love the people around us, being at